From the beautiful Finger Lakes region of upstate New York, this is the Dental Lighthouse podcast. We take questions from anyone in the dental profession and discuss what it takes to win not only in dentistry, but in life. Business, leadership, relationships, parenting, health and wellness, money management, nothing is off limits on the Dental Lighthouse podcast. I'm Jason Tanoory, your host, and have over 20 years of experience to pull from. Learn from my mistakes and let me help you collapse time so you can become the best version of yourself. Yo, welcome back. Dr. Jason here from Dental Lighthouse Podcast. Excited to be with you today. What's today? Today is Monday, and I was in Scottsdale most of the week for a coaching meeting and got a chance to present and got a chance to connect with a lot of people that I love and coach, and it filled up my cup for sure. What's interesting about last week is I had plans to do this podcast interview in person, but things kind of got away from us. Things get a little chaotic during these events. And here we are. We had the opportunity last week to do this in person, didn't have time to do it. So we're on a Zoom call on Monday morning. Pretty interesting. So super pumped about my guest today, Mr. Ryan Gross from CMOshare. Ryan, how are you doing?
Good. I was down in Scottsdale as well, as you mentioned, and now you can see behind me, I'm in pretty snow flurries. So, I like warm weather, but when you turn around and you look out and you see like it's almost like something out of one of those like screensaver Netflix or YouTube things that you put on your TV. So I'm kind of happy with this as well.
Yeah, no doubt. It's crazy. We have a lot of snow here too. And the older that I get, the less tolerant I become of the snow and cold. When I was like 15, 16
Oh
years old,
yeah.
I'd go out in shorts and it was fine, but my thermometer has changed. So it was good to go in Scottsdale. It was good to be in Scottsdale last week, even though it was only in the mid 60s. It was
Yeah.
much warmer than it is at home.
Yeah.
So, Ryan is one of the smartest people I know when it comes from a marketing and advertising perspective, the owner of CMOshare, and we'll talk a little bit about that in a little bit. But more importantly, someone that I entrust my dental organization to help mentor me, tutor me, and my operations person, Amy, on best practices when it comes to marketing, branding, and advertising. And in preparing for this interview, as you guys know, the way I work, I just like to ask questions and based on those answers, kind of see what type of rabbit hole we can go down. And I know Ryan is cut from a similar cloth. So this conversation will most likely start off at a 30,000 foot level, and then we'll probably get a little bit more granular and tactical. Is that something you're cool with, Ryan?
Yep. I love that.
So, a couple days ago, like I said, I had spoke to the big coaching group, Dr. Mark Costas's group at DSI, and one of the things that I spoke upon was scorecards or how we look at numbers on a weekly basis. Without going down a rabbit hole, the main point I was trying to make is numbers can tell us part of the story, but unless you have trust and vulnerability amongst your team, and unless they're sharing with you the details behind the details, then you really don't know. And the specific example that I gave was new patient numbers. So on a typical weekly scorecard, let's say you're trying to average 40 new patients a month, which ends up being 10 a week. So you look at this scorecard and you have a goal of 10 new patients every week. And then tracking the numbers, we see that the scorecard numbers are 6 new patients, 5 new patients, 8 new patients. So the typical dentist, and I don't want to make any assumptions here, but the typical dentist would look at those new patient numbers and not reaching the goal, and they would say, well, we must have to market more. I'm going to have to call Ryan and spend more money on SEO or whatever it is to get more new patients in. But that's not always the solution, is it, Ryan?
No, I mean, I think what you just said is something it's been on my mind a lot recently about just looking at the numbers. You start with that, but you gotta dial in a little bit more. You got to unpeel the onion to see what's really going on. And I think that's something that is important because I get that all the time. It's like, hey, I got an email or a text or a call saying, Ryan, can we put 500 more into emergency ads because the doctor's schedule's open? And I stop and I'm like, let's stop there. Why is the doctor's schedule open? And so you got to ask those questions. And I think you got to go really through and talk to your team and understand. If anybody knows me, I almost sometimes get too excited about numbers, and I will use those as the starting point, but then really figuring out what you have the numbers, what do they mean? How do you use them? And, I can look at, let me give you a great example of this. So, I can look at a call. I can look at the number of calls a practice gets if they're using Mango Voice. I can look at that and then I can say, okay, how many of those calls are answered? With just that metric, we have enough data on our side that I can predict the number of new patients that practice is going to get. So, I like to look at Google Analytics, a lot of other things too, to really narrow that down. But let's just start with that. So, if I look at a practice and they're answering 74% of their calls, and I say, hey, you should be answering 85%. That doctor calls me and says, I got to get on my staff because they're only answering 74% of their calls. And I'm like, okay, before you get on your staff, let's look at the data a little bit deeper and maybe talk to them as well. But we can go in to say, okay, you're answering 74% of your calls because you are closed on Wednesdays. I mean, it's that simple. And they're like, oh, yeah, you're right. So, or I'll say, hey, you get a lot of calls between 10 and noon on Monday, Tuesday, Wednesdays. How many people are answering the calls on that time? And they're like, I don't know. Let me ask. So I think it's really kind of asking questions after you get numbers, and then creating a solution based upon the questions you ask, the people you talk to, and using those numbers to help make a decision.
Yeah, so true. So again, let's use this fictitious example. We have an office that's trying to average 40 new patients a month, 10 a week. We look at the scorecard numbers on a weekly basis and we see that we're under goal. So you're suggesting that instead of just texting or emailing you and saying throw $500 more a month at emergency ads, the first question and from your perspective that needs to be asked is what is the call answer rate on a typical weekly basis?
Yeah, I would say in that specific situation, I would start with, okay, how many calls are we getting through Mango or Weave or whatever we're using? How many call conversions are you getting on the website right there? And you can start to look at that. And most dentists aren't going to know the numbers and the percent you should be looking off of that, but that's a starting point. So if you look at that and the first thing you say is, I'm answering 62% of my calls and I want 10 and we're at 6, then you know that that's probably the starting point. But let's just say you're answering 90%.
Okay.
Then you can look at it and say, okay, how many calls am I getting from my website? If that comes back and tells you that you're only getting enough calls for, 6 new patients a week, well, then you need to push more into marketing. Just start at the high level. But if you go through it and say, I'm only answering 60% of the calls, I'm getting 20 calls a week from my website and you're getting 6 new patients, then you can start to put the numbers together. The other thing too is the availability. That is the number one missed thing that almost every practice overlooks to an extent. I mean, even like some of the top practices don't always recognize this is what do you actually have available? So if I'm looking through, most people want a hygiene, a cleaning. That's what they want. So if I look at 60 to 70% of new patients wanting a cleaning, and I'm booking out 3 weeks for a cleaning, and that could answer the question right there. So just going through and asking questions, call answer rate, number of conversions, and my availability is a good starting point.
Yeah, 100% agree. You skipped over that middle one. When you're as knowledgeable as you are, you kind of just glance over things that I think most of us need to kind of sit with and kind of,
Yeah.
meditate on. So let's just rewind the tape a little bit and talk about that next particular question that you asked. So in this fictitious example, we're asking the first question of how many of the calls are being answered. And every office is a little bit different, but let's just say as a general rule, the goal should be 90%. That's something you can get behind?
Yeah, 85 to 90%. Yeah.
Perfect. So the next question from my perspective, at least with the coaching that I do, is of those calls that are answered, of those prospective new patients, what percent are we converting? So I've got a couple sub questions for you in terms of that, Ryan. Um, what is a good goal for new patient conversion? And what is the best way to track that metric that you've come across?
Yeah, so we just did this a couple of weeks ago. We analyzed 572,000 calls from Mango. We compared that to Google and the actual practice numbers. And we were able to come up and find that 8.56% of all inbound calls are new patients. That's the first that get converted. And so if you're getting, say, 100 calls a week, then you should have 8 to 9 new patients off of that. If you're at a standard, I mean that's looking at around say 85% call answer rate. That's if you're just average. Now here's what's interesting is that if you were to take the best practices, and if we answered 100% of the calls and converted 100%, then 14% of inbound calls are new patients. So we know that around 14% are is like 14.5% are of your total calls are new patients. But we know as an industry, off of almost 600,000 calls off of 100 different practices, that only 8.5% are actually getting converted.
Eight
So
and
you
a half,
can
8.5% of leads are getting converted?
Oh, it's 8.5% of the total calls, inbound
Okay.
calls.
Okay.
So then you can start to kind of look at that and say, okay, if I know that again, if I'm getting 100 calls and if I was the best of the best and had no error and 100%, I would get 14 patients on average. But if I'm just doing the average, I should be getting 8.5 or 8 to 9 new patients off of that.
Yeah, that makes total sense. So, with that information, the next flow chart item, I guess, for lack of a better term, would be when they don't convert, why is that? And you had already referenced a great one, availability, or how soon can I get in for a new patient exam? And I do think that if you're trying to grow a practice, that's a great metric to track on a weekly scorecard. How many days out for a 90-minute new patient appointment. But to go back to you, what in your opinion is the number one reason that a prospective new patient will call, the phone will be answered, but they don't convert?
Yeah, so I think you have this it's kind of a combination. It's going back to availability, and it's going back to ensuring that you're properly communicating availability to the patient. So I'm going to use an example outside of dentistry here for a second because it's relevant and soon. So it was Friday during the day down in Scottsdale. We were trying to get a group together to go out to dinner. And so we were looking at different restaurants. And we were sitting there, and there was like five we looked at. And, one of them was at 9:30 for 7, but there was like 10 of us. So I started thinking about this is dentistry right here in a nutshell. So we went through until we could find the restaurant that could accommodate the number of people and the time that we wanted. So here's what happens in dentistry is, and we see this a lot. So you convert an extremely high amount of your patients to call in because we can look at the data and tell, like, look at, depending on what location you're at, you can go over 90%. That's very good. But here's the difference. Let's look at a practice that doesn't. They will, because we can listen to calls and figure this out for practices that don't. So if I call and say, hey, I'd like to schedule an appointment and I just need to get in and see it gets cleaned or an exam. I've been in for a long time, and then the person will say, okay, um, well, we have an appointment. Today's Monday. We have an appointment on Thursday at 9 o'clock. Does that work for you? And if I'm like, well, no, and they're like, okay. Um, well, what does they don't get into a conversation and say it's saying something simple, something like this, and it says, okay, we have Thursday at 9, Thursday at 1, or Friday at 2. Which one of those, or which one can I, or like however you want to word it, but which one, essentially can I get you signed up for? And so that's the difference is they give one and they run into a wall, an objection, and it stops right there. And
So
if
from
because if I'm oh go ahead.
I was gonna say, so from a front desk training perspective, whoever we're depending to answer the phone and do it in the right way, you're advising that person be able to give multiple options, at least two, but preferably three or four options, and then give the prospective patient the autonomy to make a decision based on their availability.
Correct. And there's a lot of, I think, people, especially in some of the networks that we're in, are very good at this, better than I am. But I can tell you, yes. And this is another one too, is I get this often where a practice will say, an owner or doctor will say, okay, I'm booking 4 weeks out. What am I going to do? And I'm like, this is simple. So I see Addison as my dentist because I live in Lincoln, Nebraska. And this is a true happened. I got the text through his texting system saying you're overdue for your cleaning. So I responded back and I said, okay, when can I get in? This was in December. It was like I don't know, February 12th or something. We're talking over 2 months out. But
Yeah.
here's the key that they do, and they're phenomenal at it. They're like, we're going to get you on the schedule for February 12th. However, I'm going to put you on a list, and we more than likely are going to get you in the next few days. And I'm like, okay, I'll take it. I don't need to shop around, whatever. And that's the thing is, if you look at and your CEO, Amy, I mean, I'm going to throw out some names: Steve Markowitz, Addison, Bill Keith. These you are phenomenal at getting somebody in, and that's all that it matters. Is when they're on that call, and you can make that person know we're going to get you in. We might put you on the books for 2 months from now, but don't worry, I'm going to call you in a couple of days, and we're going to see you.
Yeah, it's so true. And talking about peeling back the onion, as I was managing hot seats last week in Scottsdale, one of the issues that came up constantly was the hygienist scheduling over new patient blocks for their own recall appointments. So,
Hmm.
for the listeners that don't understand what I'm talking about, the hygienist has a patient in the chair that's been with the practice for 5 years. The hygiene appointment ends. We look out 6 months to get the hygiene to get the patient back in for recall, but there's nothing available. So instead of putting them out, say 7 months or 8 months, they cover up a new patient block or take a new patient block off the schedule to schedule this recall appointment. Talk about a recipe for disaster. So what we've been doing routinely over the last year because of the hygienist shortage, the ultimate solution is to hire more hygiene, but that's easier said than done, right? But we what we've been doing, to your exact point, Ryan, is saying, Mrs. Jones, you're doing 6 months. I don't have any availability in 6 months right now. But look, here's what we're going to do. I'm going to schedule you out for my first available appointment in 8 months. I'm going to put you on an ASAP list, and I can almost guarantee that we will get you back in the schedule by the time you're due in 6 months. So Addison's doing the same thing with you, and it's good to hear. It's almost like validating that that's in fact what he's doing. Now, take that to a prospective new patient. I don't think it's going to work all the time because a prospective new patient might say, I don't have a relationship here, even though they're telling
Hmm.
me schedule in 2 months and they're going to get me in within 2 weeks. I still might be calling other offices for that appointment, but I think that's a great strategy, what you just unpacked, for prospective new patients in an effort to ultimately get them to schedule.
Yeah, and you're 100% right. You are not going to have a high conversion rate if that's the case, but you are at least opening the door rather than just saying no.
Yeah, 100% agree. So, okay, let's rewind the tape. So we got to answer the phone. We got to have capacity in the schedule. What is another? Let's say we answer the phone. Let's say we have three new patient appointments towards the end of the week. What is another thing that you're hearing and seeing that could be an obstacle to a prospective new patient converting and getting an appointment on the books?
Yeah, that's it's a little more granular there, but if you from what we have found is it really comes down to some of that phone, you know, skills and how much and I always just look at it. I try to say to dentists, like, don't look at this as an example because you're a dentist, you don't have to deal with this. Take something that's personal to you that you do and then use that as an example. So like again, let's go back to like a restaurant. If I call a restaurant and they're like, hello, and I'm like, hey, do you have any appointments for tonight at 8 o'clock? They're like, party size, four, 7 o'clock. And that's real.
Yeah,
I've actually heard practices who say things like this.
yeah,
And what's going to happen is this. You're like, well, I mean, no, thank you, hang up. Or you might just say yes and not show up.
yeah, yeah,
So it just comes down to being courteous. And I think part of it is I give a lot of advice by saying you need to hire more hygienists. You need to hire an assistant, a doctor, front desk. It's easy for me to tell people they need to hire people all day long. But one of the things that I think is overlooked is the amount of pressure that's on the front desk at times to answer a call, have someone standing in front of them doing all the things you're asked to do, it adds a lot of stress. And maybe this person's a wonderful person, but they have a line of three people waiting to check out or check in or whatever, and they're just trying to. The brain will always make you focus on the person that's standing in front of you, not the person on the phone.
Right, right.
So I think there's just a lot of pieces there that you need to analyze to determine how what's going on with those conversions.
Yeah, 100% agree. And one of the things that we talked about this past week was, patients, prospective new patients, when they call your office, and I could be wrong here, but this is the mindset that I've always had. Like, they don't know what to say. And I think a gross majority of prospective new patients by default go to the insurance question because they have really
Hmm.
nothing, they really don't know what else to say. So when you answer the phone and say, Finger Lakes Dental Care, how can I help you? And the patient on the other end says, uh, do you take Delta? Um, that conversation can go one of two ways really quick. If the person's not trained well and just says, no, we don't work with Delta, the phone call automatically ends, right?
Yes. Hmm.
Versus someone that's trained up well, who can ask the right questions, and all of a sudden they come to an understanding that yeah, maybe the patient does want to utilize their Delta benefits, but that's not the primary reason they called your office. So I think to your point, through some training at the front desk and setting that front desk person up for success, a conversation for another day, but we try to take all phone calls off of the front desk's responsibility, put them in a room where they don't have to be bothered with so many other things going on. Patients walking in, patients needing to be walked out, all of the noise and chaos that comes with a typical dental office. So yeah, 100% agree with what you're saying.
Yeah, real quick on the insurance too. I think that's a great point that gets forgotten. Like, I know from doing this what it means to be out of network, and I get it. So sometimes if I hear, "Oh, you don't take my insurance," okay, I have a better understanding of what that actually means. Go back, rewind 6, 7 years ago when I wasn't doing this, I'd be like, "Oh, I can't see you."
Exactly, 100%.
Uh-huh. So once you understand, because if you look at the bucket of people who call you for a new patient, we have stats that back this up. If you depending on the practice, about 50 to 60% of the new patients will come from some type of marketing. So Google is your lead source. Then if you look at it, 40 to 50% come from referrals. There's some practices that are up to 60%, but the 40 to 50% come from referrals. And so let's just isolate the referrals for a second. Let's just say it's 50%. If half the people are calling you based upon a referral, they want to see you.
Right,
They could have Googled and looked for anybody. No, but someone told them to come see you. If we go back to the insurance, if what you said is that's not the reason they call, is they just want to know because they don't know what to say.
right.
Nobody knows what to say. Like when you call to schedule a medical appointment, I don't even know. When I call my doctor, I'm like, yeah, I think I need to schedule my yearly exam. I don't even know. I think I do. And like that's the thing is they don't know. So they're just calling and trying to engage in a conversation. And if they want to see you, and if you just say, no, I don't take your insurance, you're like, oh, then they go back to their friends and say, well, they don't take my insurance. I couldn't see them. And that
Yeah,
friends are going to be like, oh, that sucks. But in reality, if you just said, we're not in network or however you word it, but we're happy to see you. We're going to come in. Here's why that's not a big deal.
right. And it
Mhm.
100%. And not to suggest that the right verbiage and the right scripting is going to solidify 100% of those prospective leads, but it will be way better than zero,
Yeah,
which it is now when you just say, no, we don't take Delta and you hang up the phone, right? So,
correct.
uh, in I know you're a numbers geek. I'm a numbers geek. I'd love, and I know, we're painting with a broad brush here by asking you this question, but I just have a level of curiosity. A 1 to 2 doctor practice, trying to grow. What is your what is your ballpark advice on what we should be spending on marketing?
Yeah. So that is a good question. We have those averages. Let's start it with there. Let's look at what the actual average is. If you look at let's just do a two doctor practice. And in an average location, like let's not use like LA or something that's just across the country. If you're taking a two doctor practice who is trying to grow and has availability, then the average spend right now on digital marketing is going to fall around $3,600. If you layer in internal marketing, swag items, shirts, anything else, you might be at 4,000. And so I start by doing the average, but then what I typically do if I'm talking to a practice who's just, wants us to give some recommendations, I look at first, okay, what's that percentage? That's really where I don't want to skew your percentage unless there's a reason why. So we start at, say, like a growing practice, 4.5 to 6% would be a good marketing spend of revenue. So you start there and you look at the average. So if your average, if your 4.5% falls within, say $4,000, then right there, I'm like, okay, this makes sense. And so that I kind of look at it two ways: what's the average and what it is percent of your revenue.
Awesome. So, in this fictitious example, someone's reached out to you. We've committed to spending 5 to 6% on marketing. This particular office has committed to increasing capacity, so they're onboarding another hygienist, maybe a hygienist and a half. What advice would you be giving either the operations person or the founding doctor or whoever's responsible from a from an auditing perspective with phone calls? Like how often should they be listening to phone calls? How many phone calls? Like how important is it to make sure that that part of the system is really buttoned up to allow the rest of the system to flourish?
Yeah, so I only typically look at phone calls at that level of listening. At least what we do is if we see a red flag. And so I tell people it's a red flag doesn't mean it's bad. It just means it's a number that is it's not in the normal or the average. So let's just say I look at it, and again, I'll go back to that, say 8.5% number. If I'm getting 100 calls and I'm only getting 4 new patients, I'm going to start to dive in and say maybe I need to listen to the calls. On the flip side, if I'm getting 100 calls and I'm getting 15 new patients and I'm at the higher number, I might also listen to it as well because I want to see why that is. So I'm going to only listen to calls when I see the number not be where it should be.
Hmm.
And I'm going to look at it and okay, analyze. Okay, if it is 4, let's go through and spot check 50 calls. I know it takes time, but there's some practices out there that do some great grading systems, and they have every call listened to. There's AI tools out there now as well that can help do all of this. But I think that's where you start with if what you're expecting doesn't isn't happening based upon the number of calls you're getting.
Yeah, that's great advice. Why create additional work for yourself if it's not ultimately needed, right?
Yeah,
I'm really good at that. I'm really good at creating additional work for myself when it's not necessarily beneficial.
yeah.
Awesome discussion, Ryan. I really appreciate the knowledge, really appreciate the wisdom. I know a lot of our listeners will want to go to the next level, reach out to you, maybe ask some additional questions, have some specific concerns that they don't feel were addressed on this particular podcast. What's the best way for the Dental Lighthouse listeners to get a hold of you?
Yeah, and we're always open to just talking to practices. I do it. I reserve Fridays to talk to practices, do an analysis, and just see if there's anything that any insight that I can offer. We can work with them. If you're looking to set up a call with me, you can do that by going to mycmoshare.com. So it's my CMO, like Chief Marketing Officer, share.com, and there's a link on there. You can sign up and then jump on a call with me. Also, if there are any Dental Success Network members out there, you can just go on Workplace and shoot me a message.
Awesome. Thank you so much for the time, Ryan. Really, really appreciate it. I learned a lot today. So thank you. Ladies and gentlemen, Mr. Ryan Gross.
Thank you, Jason.
Thank you. That wraps up another episode of the Dental Lighthouse podcast. You have a choice today. Choose to be a lighthouse. Lighthouses are powerful and steadfast. They are beacons of light for others to reference when life gets turbulent. Go out into the world today and become a lighthouse for someone. Give more than you get. True joy comes from serving others. Start today. I'm Jason Tanoory, your host. Thank you for listening to the Dental Lighthouse podcast. For more information, podcast show notes, or links to anything that we have discussed today, please check out our website, thedentallighthouse.com. We would love to hear from you. If you would like to get on the show, please email us at podcast@thedentallighthouse.com.